The air in the emergency department at Metropolitan General was a carefully layered thing. At the base was the sharp, sterile bite of antiseptic, a smell that clung to the inside of your nose and promised a losing battle against a million unseen enemies. Layered over that was the stale, burnt aroma of coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate for 12 hours, the lifeblood and lament of the night shift. Fainter notes wove through it all, the powdery scent of latex gloves, the faint, sweet decay of wilting flowers by the nurse's station, and beneath everything, the subtle metallic tang of fear. To Alara Vance, it was a symphony of controlled chaos, a kingdom she had sought out for its noise, hoping it would drown out the silence in her own head. Her hands, which had once field-stripped an M4 rifle in the dark during a sandstorm, now fumbled with the plastic wrapper of an IV catheter. The delicate cellophane crackled mockingly. Her knuckles, a roadmap of pale, thickened scars, seemed too large and clumsy for the task. She kept her shoulders slumped, a conscious effort to shrink her frame, to make herself less of a presence. Her movements were deliberately slow, hesitant, each action preceded by a microsecond of feigned uncertainty. It was a mask, a heavy piece of armor she wore every day, and it was exhausting. "Vance, are you going to get that line in this century? Or should I call for a specialist?" The voice was a whip-crack of condescension. Dr. Eris Thorne, chief of emergency surgery, stood with his arms crossed over a chest, puffed out by ego, and a $500 tailored shirt worn under his lab coat. His cologne, an expensive and cloying sandalwood, bulldozed through the ER's native scents. He was a man whose authority was derived entirely from the title embroidered on his coat, not from any discernible competence Alara had witnessed. In her mind, a cold, analytical part of her that never slept, she had already classified him. Loud, insecure, a potential liability in a genuine crisis. "Sorry, doctor," she mumbled, her eyes fixed on the patient's arm. She did not look at him. Looking at him meant meeting his gaze, and her eyes had a tendency to betray the meek persona she had so carefully constructed. They had been described once, by a terrified insurgent in a dusty corner of the Korengal Valley, as dead. Thorne scoffed, a sound like tearing silk. "Sorry doesn't lower patients' blood pressure. Some of us are trying to practice medicine here. If you can't handle a simple IV, perhaps you'd be better suited to restocking the supply closets." The other nurses studiously avoided looking in their direction. They had seen this show before. The new tech, Vance, the quiet, clumsy one, was Thorne's favorite target. "Understood," Dr. Alara said, her voice flat. She finally slid the needle into the vein. A perfect first stick placement. She did not allow herself the satisfaction of it. Instead, she taped it down with a slight, contrived awkwardness, as if she were surprised it had worked at all. Inside, she was reciting the 9-line medevac request. Line 1, location. Line 2, radio frequency. Line 3, number of patients by precedence. It was a catechism, a mental reset she used to wall off the sting of humiliation. The ER was not Kandahar. Thorne was not a threat. This was a quiet life. This was penance. The price of that quiet was to be invisible, to be underestimated. A ghost in cheap, scratchy scrubs. The day wore on in a procession of minor calamities and mundane complaints. A child with a fever, a construction worker with a nail in his boot, an elderly woman convinced her cat had cursed her with indigestion. Alara moved through it all with her cloak of ineptitude firmly in place. She tripped over a power cord, struggled to lift a patient onto a gurney, and answered every question from Thorne with a quiet yes. Doctor or a simple nod. He seemed to feed on it. The more she shrank, the more he expanded, his voice booming through the department, correcting her, belittling her, using her as a cautionary tale for the younger residents. "Observe people," he announced to a group of interns, while Alara cleaned a minor lateration. "This is what we call hesitation. In this field, hesitation kills. You must be decisive, confident," he glanced at Alara, "even when you have no earthly idea what you're doing." The interns chuckled nervously. Alara's hands never faltered. Her mind, however, was miles away, in a different kind of chaos. She remembered the sticky heat of a Black Hawk, the rotor wash kicking up red dust, the screaming of a young private with a shredded leg. She remembered her own hands, slick with blood, working with a speed and certainty that felt like it belonged to someone else. There had been no hesitation then. There had only been the mission. Keep them alive. She finished stitching the cut, the sutures neat, and even despite her best efforts to make them look otherwise. The patient, a nervous young man, looked at her with gratitude. "Thanks. That didn't even hurt." Before Alara could respond, Thorne stepped in. That's because I was supervising. Don't get used to it. He clapped the young man on the shoulder and turned to Alara. My office. 5 minutes. The command hung in the air. Alara simply nodded, stripped her gloves, and disposed of them in the biohazard bin. She washed her hands with methodical slowness, the rough paper towel a welcome, abrasive texture against her skin. Thorne's office was an extension of his ego. A large mahogany desk, pictures of himself sailing, a framed diploma from a prestigious university. He sat behind the desk, a king on his throne. Close the door, he said. Alara complied. The click of the latch, sounding unnaturally loud in the small space. Vance, he began, leaning back in his leather chair. I'm not sure you're cut out for this. You're slow. You're clumsy. Frankly, you're a liability on my floor. Alara remained silent. Her posture was relaxed, but her senses were on high alert. She catalogued the room. 1 window, 3 stories up. 1 door, currently closed. The desk was heavy, solid. The letter opener on his desk was brass, sharp, a potential improvised weapon. The thoughts were automatic, a reflex she couldn't turn off. I've been reviewing your file, he continued, tapping a folder on his desk. No previous experience in a major metropolitan hospital. Vague references. I'm beginning to think HR made a mistake hiring you. My file is a work of fiction, she thought. My real file is locked in a vault in a windowless building in Virginia. I'm writing you up, Thorne said, a smug little smile playing on his lips. Formal reprimand, 1 more incident, and I will have you removed. Do you understand? The urge to snap his pen, to disarm him of his petty authority with a few cold, well-chosen words, was a physical thing, a pressure building behind her sternum. But she crushed it. She needed this job. She needed this anonymity. Understood, doctor, she said. Her voice a monotone. Good. Now get out. And for God's sake, try not to break anything on your way. She turned and left, her steps measured, even. The mask was heavy, but it held. The next week was a slow-motion escalation. Thorne took her off all critical cases, assigning her to janitorial tasks and patient transport. He accidentally deleted her request for a weekend off. He took to calling her Butterfingers in front of patients and staff. Each jab was a small test of her discipline, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around her past. She found her solace in the quiet moments. In the pre-dawn hours, when the hospital was a slumbering beast, she would sit in the empty cafeteria, tracing the scars on her knuckles and letting the memories come. The smell of ozone and cordite after a breach, the weight of a dying soldier in her arms, the impossible crystalline blue of the Afghan sky. These were the ghosts she lived with, the ones she was trying to outrun by standing still. One afternoon, 2 new patients were rolled into a semi-private bay. They were soldiers, judging by their haircuts and the easy, profane banter they shared despite their injuries. One had a broken leg in a complex traction rig. The other had his arm in a sling, his face peppered with road rash. They were loud, irreverent, and filled the sterile space with a chaotic energy that felt dangerously familiar. Thorne, naturally, assigned Alara to take their vitals. Be gentle with them, Butterfingers, he sneered as he walked past. They're heroes. We wouldn't want you to drop one. The soldier with the broken leg, a corporal named Davis, grinned at her. Butterfingers, huh? That's a rough one. Don't mind him, said the other, Sergeant Miller. He's just jealous he doesn't have a cool nickname. Alara offered a small, weak smile and unwrapped the blood pressure cuff. As she reached for Miller's good arm, her sleeve rode up, exposing a few inches of her forearm. For a split second, the edge of a tattoo was visible, a complex, dark ink design that was not on the approved list for civilian life. Miller's eyes, sharp and trained to notice details, flickered down to it. His joking demeanor vanished instantly. He didn't say anything, but his gaze changed. It was a look of recognition, of confusion, and of a dawning, incredulous respect. He'd seen tattoos like that before, in places he didn't talk about, on men who moved through the world like shadows. Alara quickly pulled her sleeve down, her heart rate ticking up a single, controlled beat. A mistake. A sloppy error. She finished taking their vitals in silence, the air in the bay now thick with unspoken questions. The soldiers had stopped talking. They were just watching her with a new, unnerving intensity. She retreated from the room as soon as she could, the soldier's stares boring into her back. The mask felt thin, fragile. It was 2 hours later that the world broke open. It started not with a bang, but with a sound, a high piercing tone that cut through the mundane hum of the AR. It was the mass casualty alarm, code black. Every head snapped up. A junior nurse dropped a tray of instruments, the clatter swallowed by a sudden deafening silence. Then, chaos. What is it? Someone yelled. Multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate, the charge nurse shouted, her face pale. Bus involved. They're saying dozens of casualties. ETA 2 minutes. The ER, a place of controlled chaos, devolved into pure undiluted panic. Nurses ran in circles. Doctors shouted for supplies that weren't ready. The air crackled with fear and indecision. And then there was Dr. Thorne. He stood in the center of the floor, a deer in the headlights. His face was ashen. His hands were visibly shaking. Okay, everyone, he yelled. His voice a high-pitched squeal. We need more beds. And, get the suture kits ready. Suture kits. For a mass casualty bus crash, it was the most useless panicked order Alara had ever heard. It was the command of a man who had never seen real trauma, who was drowning in a reality his ego couldn't comprehend. For Alara, something shifted. The constant, low-grade pressure of maintaining her disguise vanished, vaporized by the searing heat of the crisis. The noise of the ER faded into a manageable, static-filled hum. Her heart rate, which had been a tightly controlled 60 beats per minute, dropped to a placid 52. The world, which had been a blurry mess of social cues and petty humiliations, snapped into crystalline focus. She saw everything. The inadequate layout of the trauma bays, the terrified look on a young nurse's face, the precise location of every crash cart, every airway kit, every bag of O-negative blood. Her mind wasn't a nurse's mind anymore. It was a tactical computer processing threats, allocating resources, and formulating a plan of action. The heavy weight of anonymity was gone, replaced by the familiar, crushing weight of command. It felt terrifyingly like coming home. The first wave of stretchers burst through the doors. A symphony of screams, moans, and the frantic shouts of paramedics filled the air. It was a tide of blood and broken bodies. Thorne was frozen, pointing vaguely. That one. Take that one to Bay 3. No, wait, Bay 4. A paramedic was shouting. We've got a tension pneumothorax here. He's crashing. The patient was a man in his 40s, his face a terrifying shade of blue, a massive bruise spreading across his chest. His breath was coming in ragged, useless gasps. Thorne rushed over, brandishing a scalpel. Okay, chest tube. Get me a chest tube tray. Doctor. There's no time for that, the paramedic yelled. He needs a needle decompression now. I am the chief of surgery here, Thorne shrieked, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the scalpel. I will not be told how to do my job. He was going to cut. He was going to try a full thoracotomy in the middle of the ER, a procedure that would take too long and kill the man as surely as a bullet. This was the moment, the point of no return, the core mission, preserve life. Overrode the personal mission, stay hidden. Alara moved. She didn't run. It was a glide, an impossibly fast and fluid motion that ate up the space between them. No, the word was quiet, but it cut through the din like a razor. She reached Thorne. Her hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. Not hard, but with an immovable, absolute pressure. Her fingers found the nerve cluster, and his hand went numb. The scalpel clattered to the floor. Let go, he hissed, his eyes wide with shock and fury. You are relieved, Doctor, Alara said. Her voice was different. The meek, hesitant tone was gone, replaced by a low, calm timbre that resonated with absolute authority. It was a voice forged in the crucible of command, a voice that had sent men to their deaths and brought others back from the brink. She pushed him. It wasn't a shove. It was a precise, controlled displacement of mass. He stumbled back, out of the way, his expression a comical mixture of outrage and disbelief. The mask shattered. It didn't crumble. It disintegrated. Her posture snapped ramrod straight. Her shoulders squared. The apologetic slump was gone, replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator. Her gaze, no longer shielded, swept across the room, hard and analytical. You, she barked at a terrified-looking young nurse. Get me a 14-gauge needle and an alcohol swab. Now. The nurse stared, frozen. Move. The single word was a physical blow. The nurse scrambled to obey. Alara turned back to the patient. With 2 fingers, she found the space between his second and third ribs. It was an act of anatomical certainty, of pure muscle memory. The nurse returned, slapping the needle into her waiting palm. Without a moment's hesitation, Alara plunged the long needle into the man's chest. There was a sickening crunch as it punched through cartilage, followed by a loud hiss. It was the sound of trapped air escaping, the sound of a lung reinflating, the sound of a life being saved. The bluish tint on the man's skin began to recede. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Alara didn't wait for thanks. She was already moving. Carter, she yelled. Ben Carter, a young, capable nurse who had always been quietly competent, looked up, startled. Treege. Red tags to this side, yellow to the back. greened to the waiting room. Go! He hesitated for only a second, his eyes flicking from Alara's commanding form to Thorne's sputtering, impotent rage. He made his choice. He nodded. Yes, Mom. He started directing the flow of bodies, his voice gaining confidence with every word. He was the first follower. The ER became her battlefield. She moved through the chaos like a ghost, a whirlwind of lethal competence. She saw not patients, but objectives. Femoral artery bleed, a paramedic shouted over the din. A young woman's leg was soaked in blood, the crimson tide pulsing with every beat of her failing heart. Alara was there in an instant. She didn't have a tourniquet. She didn't need one. She jammed her thumb into the woman's groin, finding the pressure point with brutal precision. The bleeding slowed to a trickle. Hold this, she ordered another nurse, placing the woman's own hand over hers. Do not let go. She moved to the next. A man with a compromised airway, gurgling on his own blood. An intubation kit would be too slow. Get me a scalpel and a number 10 blade, she commanded. Ben Carter, now her de facto second-in-command, had it in her hand in seconds. With 3 quick, precise movements, a vertical incision, a horizontal slice through the cricothyroid membrane, and the insertion of a hollow plastic tube from a ballpoint pen she'd snatched from a chart, she created a new airway. The gurgling stopped. The man breathed. It was a cricothyrotomy, a procedure most surgeons would only dare in a sterile operating room, and she had performed it in 10 seconds with a pen. From their bay, the 2 soldiers, Davis and Miller, watched with wide, disbelieving eyes. The clumsy nurse, Butterfingers, was gone. In her place was something they recognized, something they revered and feared in equal measure. Jesus Christ, Davis whispered, his voice full of awe. She moves like one of the unit guys. Miller's face was pale. He remembered the tattoo. He remembered the flat, dead look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. She's not like one of them, you idiot, he breathed. She is one of them. Thorne, meanwhile, had been reduced to a spectator at his own catastrophe. He stood on the periphery, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. This is chaos. This is insubordination. You're all fired, he screamed. But no one was listening. His authority had evaporated, burned away by the sheer, undeniable force of Alara's competence. He was irrelevant, a loud, useless noise in a room that now ran with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a military field hospital. For the next hour, Alara was the still point in the turning world. She set bones, sutured wounds, and directed the flow of patients and personnel with a calm, unshakable authority. She diagnosed a splenic rupture with a quick abdominal palpation. She identified a brain bleed from the uneven dilation of a patient's pupils. It was a masterclass in trauma medicine, performed under the worst possible conditions. The staff, from the senior nurses to the janitors, pressed into service as runners, orbited her, following her clipped, precise commands without question. They had seen real leadership, and it had nothing to do with a fancy title. Slowly, the tide turned. The last of the critical patients was stabilized and sent up to the OR. The screams faded to whimpers. The chaos subsided into a weary, blood-soaked order. The ER was a wreck, a disaster zone of discarded wrappers, bloodied linens, and exhausted bodies. But everyone who had made it through the doors alive was still alive. Alara stood in the center of it all, her scrub stained, her face a blank mask of exhaustion. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a deep, familiar ache. The weight of the mask was settling back onto her shoulders. That's when Thorne made his move. He strode toward her, his face livid, a vein throbbing in his temple. Vance, he spat, the name a curse. My office. Now, a few of the nurses moved to stand in his way, a silent, protective wall. Ben Carter stepped forward. Doctor, she just saved a dozen lives. She undermined my authority, Thorne roared. She performed procedures she is not qualified for. She is a reckless, dangerous liability, and she is fired. Get out of my way. He pushed past them and stalked toward his office. Alara, with a weary sigh, followed him. This was the price. She had known it would be. She entered the office. Thorne was behind his desk, his hands shaking again, this time with rage. You are finished, he seethed. I will have your certification revoked. You will never work in a hospital again. Who the hell do you think you are? Before Alara could answer, the office door opened. It opened without a knock. A man stood there, tall and lean, in a pristine Army Class A uniform. On his shoulders were the silver eagles of a full colonel. He had short, graying hair, a face carved from granite, and eyes that held the quiet, absolute confidence of a man who had seen and done things Thorne could not even imagine. He exuded an aura of command that made Thorne's blustering seem like a child's tantrum. The colonel's eyes scanned the room, bypassing the furious surgeon and landing on Alara. His stern expression softened, replaced by a look of utter, profound disbelief. "Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Sergeant Major Vance, what in God's name are you doing in a hospital supply closet?" It was an old joke between them, from a time and place far from here. Thorne's jaw dropped. "Sergeant? Major?" he stammered. "This is a nurse tech, a clumsy, incompetent one at that." The colonel's gaze shifted to Thorne, and it was like being targeted by a predator drone. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice flat and dangerous. "I am Dr. Eris Thorne, Chief of Surgery," he announced, puffing out his chest, trying to reclaim some shred of his authority. "And this woman is fired for gross insubordination." The colonel ignored him. He took a step toward Alara. "One of my men was brought in here," he said quietly. "Sergeant Miller. He called my personal cell. Said something about a ghost walking the halls of Met Gen. Said you saved his life and half his platoon back in the day. He also said this: Doctor was about to fire you." Alara just nodded, too tired to speak. The colonel turned his full attention back to Thorne. "Doctor," he began, his voice deceptively calm, "let me tell you who you are about to fire. You are firing Sergeant Major Alara Vance, former senior medic for a unit you are not cleared to know about. This woman has more confirmed saves in active combat than you have years of experience. She developed half the protocols for massive hemorrhage control that are currently used by every special operator in the United States military. The procedure you were about to botch. She wrote the manual on it, literally. I have a copy in my desk." He took another step closer, his shadow falling over Thorne's desk. "She holds the Distinguished Service Cross for pulling 3 men out of a burning vehicle under direct enemy fire. She has a Bronze Star with a V for Valor. She has a list of commendations so long it would take me an hour to read them. And you called her Butterfingers." Thorne had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. He was shrinking in his chair, the expensive leather suddenly too big for him. "I came here to check on my soldier," the colonel said, his voice now laced with ice. "But I think I'm going to make another call first. To the hospital board. I'm going to tell them that their chief of surgery, in the middle of a mass casualty event, froze, panicked, and then tried to fire the single most qualified trauma specialist on the entire eastern seaboard. How do you think that conversation is going to go?" Thorne looked like he was about to be sick. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Pack your things, Doctor," the colonel said, the words a final judgment. "You're relieved." He used Alara's own words, turning them into a sentence of professional death. Security was called. Dr. Eris Thorne, the petty tyrant, was escorted from his kingdom of controlled chaos, a sputtering, defeated man, stripped of his title and his power. The colonel turned back to Alara. The hardness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary respect. "It's good to see you, Alara, even like this." "You too, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We could use you back," he said. "Head instructor slot at Bragg. Name your price." Alara looked out the window. At the flashing lights of the remaining ambulances, at the organized, quiet aftermath of the storm she had weathered. The quiet life she had sought had been an illusion. True quiet wasn't the absence of noise. It was the absence of incompetence. "Let me think about it, sir," she said. He nodded, understanding. "Your call, Sergeant Major. Always." He gave her a small, sharp nod and left. Alara walked back out into the ER. The staff parted for her like the Red Sea. Their faces were a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a little bit of fear. She was no longer Vance, the clumsy tech. She was a myth made real. Ben Carter approached her, holding out a fresh set of scrubs. "We saved you a cup of coffee," he said, his voice full of a new profound respect. "Mom," Alara took the scrubs. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. It felt strange on her face, like an unused muscle. The mask was gone. The ghost had been seen. And in the quiet, competent hum of the recovering emergency room, she finally felt something that resembled peace.